Hello, everyone. Broadcasting live from the borderlands of Canada's National Capital Region. I bid you all good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are across the continent, around the world. I'm Campbell Morera, and this is the Invisible Night School. The Invisible Night School. There, I got it that time. Tonight, I am very excited to be introducing a guest that I have been really looking forward to speaking with. Deborah Hyde is with us, and I just closed the link accidentally to the introduction that I had prepared. So I'm just going to bring her on right now. Deborah, hi.
Hello. Hi there.
So for everybody joining us, since I messed up the intro, would you be able to provide a brief rundown of what it is that you do in this space?
Well, I'm really fascinated by dark folklore and by superstition, but unusually I don't believe in any of it. So I'm not a cynic, I'm a skeptic, which means that I look for kind of more realistic reasons why people would come up with these peculiar experiences and peculiar stories. And I edited the Skeptic Magazine, the UK Skeptic Magazine, for 10 years. And I'm a member of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry based in the US. So I do podcasts and articles, and I'm writing a book. So generally talking on this subject.
Excellent. I have been listening to some of your appearances on other podcasts, and I really enjoy your perspective. Something that I thought was really neat and I related to was that you shared an experience from your childhood that you felt influenced you strongly into becoming interested in this subject. And I was wondering if you could sort of talk about that a little bit and maybe talk about how your perspective shifted over time and what led to that.
Well, if I think the one you may be speaking about is when I believed in ghosts. I was so terrified of ghosts. Lots of people are when they're young.
Yeah.
And I woke up in the middle of the night and I absolutely heard this noise. I heard this noise. You know, it wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a dream. And I made sense of it straight away. It was like somebody had some pebbles or something and they were just throwing them up in their hand and catching them. And then there was a loud clang as though somebody had got these pebbles and thrown them against the radiator in the corner of the room. And I was absolutely terrified because it had happened and I had heard it.
Yeah.
Well, a couple of days later, I found that there were some coins, some Norwegian coins I'd had because I'd done a project on Norway. And I'd woken up in the night and the tape had started to peel off the paper. And that was what I could hear. I could hear this kind of noise. But I hadn't just heard an undiagnosed noise. I turned it into a whole story. I mean, I thought that it was the sound of pebbles. And then, of course, when they finally came completely loose, they fell down on top of the radiator. That was the clanging I heard. And it made such an impact because I realized instantaneously I had made a whole story out of some ambiguous information. And I thought, well, you know, I know people aren't dumb for doing this. I think it's probably a fairly natural thing to do. And that experience of it happening to me I think was very formative. I still continue to believe for many years afterwards, but I kind of go back to that one as being the start of looking for other explanations.
That's something I've seen a lot when I look into the study of pedagogy, like teaching people things, and in order to try to communicate better, but also to understand my own mind. And something I've seen in the research is that the most effective way to bring new information into somebody's worldview that they perhaps have a resistance to initially is to have it be somebody who has had the perspective that they have and then has gone through the chain of reasoning that has led them to change their perspective. So that person is actually much better at convincing somebody than somebody who has never had that process happen.
Well, yeah, because you're relating to someone instead of speaking down to them, I guess.
Right. And that's something that even in my own experience, yeah, I sort of jumped into this subject pretty quickly in 2021 during the pandemic. I was the first. Yeah, I'm an atheist from as early as I can imagine. A empiricist. I studied philosophy at university, so
Yeah, that helped.
I don't have any historical interest. Like it just wasn't on my radar at all to even think about supernatural or UFOs or anything. And then for some, I guess I know the reason. There's just the pandemic and all the trauma, and my business got shut down, and I was left with time. And then this UFO stuff kept being on my mainstream news feed, and I'm just what the heck's going on with this? Why is President Obama talking about this? All this stuff. So the trauma opened my mind to sort of looking at different things, and it's sort of the way that the brain works is that you need a radical shift when these huge things happen.
Oh yeah.
And so in the skeptic community, when I've started to engage on it, I was kind of coming at it, and I still do, from a naturalization perspective, like trying to understand what people are actually describing, relating that to natural phenomena and things like that. But there's a debate I've seen in the skeptic community, and it extends to ghosts and other things too, where there's a resistance to trying to provide any explanation at all, because oftentimes there is just there's a variety of reasons why that is. Is that something that you're familiar with in the skeptic community in a broader sense? Just because I'm very curious about that element of it.
Not over here. Because the skeptic communities are slightly different in North America, and I appreciate that Canada and the US are very culturally different, respectively, and the UK. I think religion is, it's open season on religion over here, so people are quite happy to talk about why, the practical reasons why people may have religious or superstitious or supernatural experiences. Actually, one of the most popular podcasts on the BBC at the moment, on BBC Sounds channel over here, is one called Uncanny. And I go on that from time to time. And what they do is they have people who've had strange experiences, and they get two what they call experts. And one tends to be a skeptic and one tends to be a believer, and they both offer different perspectives on it. So I think the thought of doing a show like that over here without a skeptic perspective on it would probably be a bit counterintuitive. So as far as ghosts and everything goes, I think there's a very good discourse in the UK. Obviously, ghosts are really entertaining. And we have the shows where people go into haunted houses and there's not enough light and they can hear ambient noises and the presenter screams in the corner of the room, and it's entertainment too. But I do think we have an active discourse about the skeptical perspective on it.
Right now, yeah, on this show, we often do talk about UFOs, but we've gone into broader subjects as well, relating to folklore. We had Brian Sentis on, who does study that stuff, and there are a lot of commonalities. Obviously, we've also sort of touched on the occult, and Marco Visconti was on, and things like that. The modern practice of ritual magic. From your experience engaging with these subjects, how do you draw the line? This is actually a question that Leah suggested to me to ask. How do you draw the line between engaging with it in a way that is pro-social, is helping out, versus increasing attention at all onto subjects that can sort of get people very fixated, focused, maybe harmful in some respects? If we're talking about them, what do you use as that defining point where it's pro-social, causing benefit to be talking about it, versus like causing harm?
I don't know if there is. I do think there probably is harm to be done if you speak about a lot of supernatural stuff in a believing sense, because you can encourage people to part with money, you can encourage people to part with their wits and their logic. If you're offering a skeptical perspective, I don't know if there is a limit. I suppose you have to gauge each show you go on to as the sort of entertainment element of it. Are you going to be there just as a just to offer not really any perspective. I think anyone who stands to be harmed by a belief in stuff like this, for example, becoming psychologically dependent on mediums or psychics, I don't think that a skeptical perspective on media is going to make it any worse for them. Hopefully, if they're just regularly reminded that there is a skeptical perspective, then that would minimize harm, in fact.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. This is something that you brought up the mediums and things like that. Actually, somebody who's important to me in my life recently, they have not historically expressed a belief in mediums, but then a friend of theirs took them to a large sort of auditorium-based style where the person is sort of trying to speak to individual members of the audience randomly. And the outcome of that was that the person I'm talking about was a little initially skeptical. It seems like the presenter picked up on that, started focusing in, and ended up having them, crying, thinking that they're being spoken to by a deceased relative. And now the medium told them that every time they see a dime on the ground, it's this deceased person communicating with them. And now they have a huge collection of dimes, and it's like the dimes have nothing to do with the relationship. So it's like, it's a nice little reminder of the person, but it has no relationship to their experience with them. Would you be able to sort of break down what's going on there from your perspective?
Yeah, I think there are several things going on there. First of all, I do think there are an awful lot of people who believe with all their hearts that they have psychic powers, and they sort of tend to be nickel and dime workers, and they just they have private clients. If you have someone who's filling auditoriums, then that's a bit more of a carny vibe, isn't it? I mean, that's sort of you can just imagine someone filling a tent or a revival tent. I mean, it's the same kind of psychological dynamic. The thing I would always say to somebody who's got a good reading from a psychic is that go to a magician, you'll get a better reading.
Right.
People who actually perform magical tricks, conjurers, when they are psychological conjurers, they are really good at this stuff, usually better than the carnies, and they use the same techniques. I mean, generally what you start with is what are called Barnum statements. They're sort of general statements that tend to apply to 70 or 80% of the room, and you can zero in and you can make people feel as though you're saying things that are really highly relevant and specific to them, and then you can, depending on their reactions, you can kind of narrow in, and people tend to forget the negative hits, the things where somebody's just wrong. They tend to remember the experience badly, which is why it's good to get it filmed, or at least getting someone to take notes for you. And then if you give them a prover that is commonplace enough, but that they wouldn't have noticed otherwise, like finding a dime. I mean, we all find dimes fairly regularly. So this person now just feels like there's a callback. So psychologically, what's happened to your friend is very predictable, and you could have a conjurer explain it far better than I could. I think also the fact that they lost someone recently means that they are in a rather vulnerable position where they would like to believe. I mean, who wouldn't like to believe that you've lost someone, but they're still kind of close to you? This stuff can get really evil sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a good little transition, actually, because the title of the show for today was Dark Folklore. That's your specialization, vampires, werewolves, and things of that nature, which is all part of the bigger supernatural, paranormal world. So there are these. It's so easy to understand the positives, right? It's like, who doesn't want to live forever? Like, part of why I engage so thoroughly in study of religion is that I want to live forever. I want that, and I just can't find evidence to support that. It's kind of funny. Like, there's the whole story about Genghis Khan searching his entire kingdom for all of these people saying that they can provide infinite life, and yet once they were brought into the castle, couldn't make it happen. So
yeah, and you wouldn't want to piss Genghis Khan off, would you? I mean, I'm surprised they made these claims.
yeah, but well, yeah, I mean, it's like you're advertising yourself, and then you find out Genghis Khan's looking for you. It's like, oh, I'm in trouble. Wrong career
Yeah.
path in that moment. So for like the really positive stuff is so understandable. What there are these very dark elements to the paranormal, though, like supernatural. Could we get into a little bit about where does this darkness originate?
Well, I think your assumption there is, first of all, that God isn't dark, and so the thought that I mean, the thought that they are kind of at opposite ends of a spectrum, and that God's really cool and light, and that all of these things are responsible for the bad stuff. I mean, that's only a specific kind of theology. You tend to get that with monotheism, with Judaism, Christianity, Islam, where you have a God which is, supposed to represent everything good, and then you're stuck because you have to account for the evil in the world. But there's an awful lot of religious environments where their gods are a little bit more nuanced, they're a little bit more human, and they fail, or they have some what we would regard as good characteristics and some as bad. So I would say, I think what has tended to happen in the past is that people think that religious, and this is one of the reasons that I wanted to study all this stuff, is because people think that religion is a very serious subject, and then they think that vampires are very frivolous. And my attitude really has been, and I guess this is what I've tried to do all this time, is to say, well, look, people have faithfully believed in both things, and those people weren't dumb. And so that's got to say something about humanity. Why can we not question whether or not the underpinnings of a belief in God are the same as the underpinnings in a belief in a vampire? And that's kind of my starting point.
Interesting. And so with vampires and werewolves, there's this like transition from being a human and then becoming a monster. And that's a pretty fascinating thing to me, because, obviously it mirrors people's experience with other people in reality, where you sort of perceive that over time they can change and become somebody they aren't. That's more, abstract, but in like a real sense. So once again, somebody in my life developed migraine suddenly. Sudden, intense headache experience, and now sensitivity to light, loud noises, things like that. And I was thinking about it, like 500 years ago, I would be thinking that they can't go outside and stuff during the day. It's like it sounds a lot like a vampire in many ways. And then like sometimes pain, not with this individual, but pain can be so bad from them that produces hallucinatory effects. So it's like having visions, you can't go outside, all this stuff. Like there are these real things that are observed, and then they're interpreted in various ways, right? Like where and when it's happening. What's your perspective on that, sort of the impulse to see these transitions manifest themselves in these like monster stories?
I think one of the most difficult transitions we face, perhaps the most difficult philosophical transition that we face, is the transition from life to death. It's very, very hard to intuit that someone just isn't there anymore, because they're lying there. I mean, they don't move voluntarily anymore, they don't speak voluntarily anymore, but they're kind of still there. And then they rot slowly. And there are all sorts of religious ideas and religious models of the self that encompass a way that this can happen. So usually there's an intuitive dualism, where there are at least two parts to the person. There could be more, actually. I mean, in Christianity, there's the body and the soul. But in voodoo, in Haiti, you would have there are two types of what they call bon ange, big angels, and then there's the body, the core cadaver, you know, literally the meat that you're in, and then there's the zetoile, which is your sort of like your fate. So it slowly, with these various forces, it accounts for the fact that your soul is separate to your body, and also that there is an animating principle in your body which leaves it slowly, which accounts for the decomposition. And in ancient Egypt, I think there was the, you know, the car and the bar, and, you know, they have a multidimensional model of the person as well. So it seems to be counterintuitive to us that somebody could just disappear. So worship of the ancestors and a relationship with your ancestors appears to be the sort of most, the earliest and a very strong form of religiosity. It's a relationship with people who have gone, and with vampirism in specifically, the thought is that the general idea is suggested by a guy called Jan Pekowski, that really the specific ideas have come from Slavic pagan ideas, and they've been incorporated with Orthodox Christianity. And the idea is that the earth is a mother, and so receives you like a mother when you die, and that if you're spat back out, there's something wrong with you. There's something fundamentally morally askew, you know, askance with you. And another guy called Paul Barber has written a brilliant book, Vampires, Burial and Death, where he goes through a lot of post-mortem changes that happen to a perfectly normal body. And it could be misunderstood by people who haven't read a book on the subject. I mean, you know, our ancestors didn't keep corpses around because they were a dreadful source of contagion. So they wouldn't realize that, you know, corpses buried too close to the surface of the earth, for example, especially in the summer, can kind of pop and move because there are air spaces and stuff in them. So, you know, you develop gases. So that an awful lot of the physical descriptions we hear associated with folklore of vampirism are congruent with normal post-mortem changes in people's bodies. But it's also, vampirism is really, really associated with epidemic death. And so if you have people with very heightened sense of attention because they are worried about the mechanism of this death. They didn't know about microbes or viruses. They didn't know. They did have a sense of contagion. A lot of sort of pre-19th century people had a very, very good sense of contagion and keeping things clean. But they know that something has spread among the community. They don't know the mechanism. They know that it spreads amongst families. And then the next thing is the body won't kind of, you know, decompose as it should. It's busy moving around in its grave. So that's how basically it all comes together to create vampirism and the folklore associated with vampirism.
That's something that I touch on a lot with looking at UFOs, is that there's often like a kernel of truth to a lot of the claims. There's something that was seen fundamentally.
Yeah.
Something that you've talked about before is having sleep paralysis. And that's something that I'm pretty familiar with, not the paralysis itself, but hypnopompic hallucinations when I wake up in rare instances. And it's strange because I can move fully. It's like 5 to 10 seconds. I'll see something that's not there. And when I started looking seriously at the stuff, it was shocking to me to see that there are a huge number of people whose entire like professional careers are dedicated to reporting these experiences and interpreting them under various sort of supernatural frameworks. And so like there's such a distinction there from observation to interpretation. Would you be able to potentially describe a little bit about how you, within your own mind, shifted from believing in ghosts to becoming the editor of the top like Skeptic Magazine in England or the UK?
Well, I was fortunate enough to grow up with a load of mad aunties, and they all they all believed in this stuff. It's funny, my mother was a very responsible woman, wouldn't let me watch horror movies in case they warped my fragile little mind. But then she would take me to talk to these women who would tell me the most blood-curdling stories that were allegedly true. And so it had a tremendous effect on me. And I read, obviously you read every trashy magazine you can get your hands on. And I read a book called The Black Arts by Richard Cavendish. Now, Richard Cavendish was the editor of a series of magazines, very, very good compendium of magazines called Man, Myth and Magic. And he didn't believe in any of this. And I wasn't allowed to read a book called The Black Arts, so I had to read it quietly under the covers at night. And it was the first time I think I'd been introduced to the idea that a lot of ritual magic was actually a rather orderly body of knowledge, and not all of it was accurate. A lot of it really wasn't particularly accurate, but it was kind of the beginnings of the attempts of the philosophy of science, really. That's how you end up with people as clever and distinguished as Isaac Newton being into both alchemy and physics, because those two weren't completely disambiguated at that point in history. So I was aware, from a fairly early age, I was aware that all of this stuff wasn't completely random nonsense. And then I think if you stop reading the trashy magazines and you start reading the books, it's unavoidable, really. You can look into the history of things and the anthropology, and you understand that people aren't dumb, but that we do make mistakes. We are not, we're built for survival, not truth. So we make very regular perceptual mistakes. And in addition, we live in a very sort of atypical neural environment. We can think about things in an abstract way. My dog is lovely, but she doesn't do that. We do that because we have language and we can think about time and what's going to happen. We can contemplate our own deaths in the way that my dog doesn't. And we have a social process. And those social processes get engaged in creating stories. And next thing is you have a culture, and the culture not only includes a God who loves you, it includes the thing that makes you trip over and bash your nose, or makes you catch a disease, or you have to account for the stuff that happens to you, the bad stuff that happens to you too.
Absolutely. And so I see that a lot, as I mentioned just in the last thing, that a lot of people have these experiences and then they interpret them based on the subjective framework that they're working with, and those interpretations can be absolutely harmless, or they can be harmful. And something I've sort of grown to appreciate more as I, just get older is that the values that you share with somebody are often a lot more important than sort of agreeing on these like sort of technical details.
Oh yeah.
And so in your personal life, is your primary, do you have close relationships with people who believe deeply in the
oh yeah
spiritual? And maybe would you be able to talk just a little bit about how that works on a social level, just for the viewers, maybe as a model or a frame? Do you sort of have positive engagement on those, or do you mainly avoid them? Does it depend on the person?
No, I think I tend to have positive engagement with them. I would have a very hard time admiring and being a friend with somebody who charged a lot of money, in a theatre for telling people about their dead relatives. So I don't think I could manage with that. But people having personal beliefs, no, it's absolutely fine. You just talk about them. I offer them potential explanations of their experiences that aren't supernatural, and they either go for them or they don't. And also, I can't be reductive about everything. I mean, I wasn't there. I don't have the evidence. All I have is their personal, their personal discussions about what happened to them. So I think you can talk to people. I mean, the only people you can't really talk to are fundamentalists of any stripe. You know, they're fundamentalists, you know, with their religion or with other beliefs.
Right. And so, and with the belief in, we mentioned briefly, like ritual magic, especially modern occult practices. I didn't really ever look into it until we had Marco Visconti on. I thought that was a really
Mhm.
positive conversation. I found it really interesting. And he was saying fundamentally, it doesn't necessarily matter where the power is coming from. It's a set of
Yeah,
rituals and things like that. I thought that was kind of neat. I never knew that at all. And then I dove into a little bit and I found like people describing rituals that help regulate your daily life, how you deal with stress, things come up, and you can sort of sit down and meditate on the specific
yeah,
solution. And it's just being described as magic. And
yeah.
it,
I totally. I mean, and you don't, you know, you don't have to go for one mechanism or the other. It may well be that uh, you know, the concentration on a specific outcome is the thing that helps it to manifest. That's purely psychological mechanism, or it might be that, you know, you've asked a fairy to help you and the fairy has helped you. So and a lot of I tend to get on with pagans, actually, sort of modern pagans. Uh, you know, and I don't know what mechanisms they ascribe to what they do, but rituals are important for human beings. Even if you don't, even if you aren't religious, you might have a secular marriage, just because, you know, it's an event, it's a ritual, it's a way of saying to your community, we two people want to be regarded as being together in the future, and rituals are important.
yes, they are. I've experienced that myself, especially with starting up a farm business and things like that, and just getting into a groove and having that ritualized process without even having the words to label it previously. It just sort of manifests itself as a way of sort of comfortably moving through and keeping things moving in a way where like the disruption from the lockdowns, which I did fully support despite them really causing a negative impact on me, it it was a huge shift, and not only just from like all of the bigger fears, it was like the daily interruption. And I had a couple like one of my partners on the business at the time was we had all moved to the farm to work together in isolation, and he was describing to me how he just wishes he could go back to his daily routine more than anything. And
Yeah.
it was really hitting home there. So there's something deep in that. And
Well, I also run my own business, and as you know, if you're self-employed, you have to invent your own rituals. You have to decide when you get up in the morning. You have to, you know, decide when you're going to go shopping, because it's too easy to go shopping in the middle of the day when you should be working. You know, it's stuff like that that actually that keeps you on the straight and narrow. Otherwise, you know, yeah, you need to invent your own rituals. You need to invent your own kind of timetable.
yeah, yeah. I just remembered a little thing about like, okay, so this observation versus interpretation thing. I go on about this a lot on this show. I think it's so important, really. I think that it's really the key is having people recognize this distinction. Now, let me think. How do I introduce this? I find this to be kind of an interesting thing. So I consider myself to be a realist. I think that it's likely, I wouldn't say I insist on it, I think it's likely that physical things around us are fundamentally real in some sense. I think that there is a very
Yeah,
strong obligation to argue against that. However, when I engage with physicists, it's I don't reject it, but the modern consensus approach is that reality it's an anti-realist philosophy that is the foundation of modern physics. The idea of superposition, that the object doesn't exist materially until it's measured. That raises some issues sometimes for me. Like a lot of the time, there's a response to sort of these basic points based on empiricism, scientific method, and things when I'm saying something like that. And then the response is like, well, on the quantum level, teleportation is real. So like, you're saying this isn't real, but we have this thing here. And then I look into it, and then there are like sufficient plausible realist interpretations, I won't go into obviously the details, but when there are plausible realist interpretations and the mainstream guiding philosophy of the scientific community is anti-realist, it kind of concerns me on a sort of underlying existential or epistemological combination of those things. Have you sort of encountered this at all? And how do you approach that when people start bringing up like the quantum world to justify belief in these sort of more extreme things?
Well, I think there are two ways. Is first of all, we don't live at the quantum level. So, things are pretty funky elsewhere. Yeah, we know that. I mean, I can't grow my plants in the Sahara. It doesn't mean to say I can't grow them here. I live in a place where it rains. So to a degree, it kind of doesn't matter. It doesn't apply. And we know that Newtonian physics still works up here. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I don't think when we don't know something, I don't think people get to just transfer every desire they have onto this unknown model. It's just like, oh, well, subatomic physics is pretty funky, therefore ghosts exist. Because I think there's probably a mechanism in there. Well, you've got to be a bit more specific than that. And so it's, I think there's an awful lot of wish fulfillment and wish transference really on this subject. As soon as, it started with the Tower of Physics, didn't it? Was that in the 1960s or the 1970s?
I don't know that one.
Yeah, and you just, the idea is that you come up with a hypothesis and you test it, and you find out whether or not it's probably right. And you can't, a hypothesis isn't just an all-purpose wish fulfillment. It's just like, things are weird subatomically, therefore, also quite often it might account for ghosts, but it might even account for poltergeists, which doesn't account for werewolves. So how come, how come an awful lot of the psychological models that we have account for some poltergeist stuff and some werewolf stuff, but your explanation doesn't account for the werewolves? So, get them which is more likely. I think it's those two things.
Yeah. Okay. Are you okay? That your reference there just reminded me. Are you familiar at all with the merger of the UFO community with the broader paranormal community in terms of like Dr. Jacques Vallée sort of starting in the 70s saying like it's all the same thing? And we've got like accounts of basically poltergeists being combined with UFO phenomena, people reporting at least one account of seeing like a dog man, which is sort of like a werewolf. So there's this recognition implicitly that it's like kind of all the same thing.
Yeah, God, it's almost like it's anomalies in human perception.
Yeah, almost.
And there's also sleep paralysis is another big one as well. Vestibular sensations when you're going off to sleep. There are an awful lot of people who are kidnapped by UFOs who feel that they have been floating above their beds and been taken through a wall, or who've been spun in a room. And that's happened to people who've been, attacked by vampires or attacked by ghosts as well. And it's totally typical stuff, vestibular stuff, just to do with balance and your self-orientation, that goes a bit funky as you go to sleep or as you wake up in the middle of the night. So it makes sense to me that there's overlapping phenomena and explanations in these things.
Right. Okay. Well, and so a very brief anecdote. Just a couple days ago, and this relates to interpretation versus observation. My wife and I were walking down the street to just go to walk around downtown a little bit, and there's this heritage building, very large, old, like mansion. Like it's such a classic kind of like it's boarded up and stuff. Yeah, and it's not considered haunted, but it's creepy at night. It's very dark and stuff. We walked right past it, and as we were sort of walking by, there's this big front gate up a stone stairs, and I could hear a bell ringing right at the front gate, and I was like, and I've been there so many times, it's like I know there's not a bell there, and I'm like, there's something weird there, and I like laughed, out loud because I was like, that's way too perfect. Like if somebody believed in ghosts, they'd have a panic attack. And so we kept walking. And then a couple seconds later, out of the corner of my eye, I see something running at me from the gate. And I'm like, wow, like I jumped. And it was just a cat with a bell on the collar. And but I jumped when I saw something physically coming at me. And I had decided not even to mention the bell as we were walking by to my wife, just because like she doesn't believe in ghosts now, but she grew up believing in them, so she's a good spook. Doesn't want to go to like the graveyard at night. Don't ask me why I want to go, but the so there's this sort of like the observation and then interpretation, but then I still reflexively reacted after hearing the thing, right? So it's like built in so strongly. Would you be able to like identify why it is now, like when we have sufficient explanations for most of these sort of like even like the darkest stuff that I don't think people would want to believe fundamentally is real, like the darkest stuff, but they still do. Like what do you interpret as happening there?
Well, I think the assumption there is that belief is a conscious process. So it can be consciously dispensed with. And I think that probably isn't the case. An awful lot of the interpretations and the mythology and the specific stories do happen in our conscious mind, but really our brains are responding to subconscious stimuli and to subconscious ways of processing things. And when you learn something really young, it's very hard to unlearn it. I think that we an awful lot of these things we have, like perceiving agency, for example. Even if you don't believe in anything, and I don't, I mean, I've slept in haunted castles and stuff.
Nice.
It was fine. And even if you don't believe in agency, if you don't believe in ghosts, if you hear a noise in the middle of the night, you're alert. You're worried that it's something, and that it's something with a mind, and it's something with an intention, and that it has it has intentions to do something. So and also you had better believe that too, because frankly your genes aren't that great if you don't. You're going to pass on your genes to some incredibly complacent kids who are going to walk in front of traffic. So it's processes like that all come together to make us hyper attentive to potential hazards in our environment. And I don't think you can completely deprogram people from that.
Right. I mean, I suspect there would be issues if people were completely deprogrammed, like you mentioned. Like, there's a healthy level of being alerted to something unusual. The bump in the night is a good example. It could be the dog, or it could be breaking in, or it's unlikely for it to be breaking in, or but when there's a risk of catastrophic failure, then it's good to at least be aware of and consider that risk.
Well, funny enough, a few years ago now, my partner and I were working in Prague, and we were working so hard. God, we were working so hard. We were so tired. And we both had all sorts of sleep disturbances, sleep paralysis and lucid dreaming, and, all kinds of things. And we were in an apartment, a rental apartment, and we were due to leave in a couple of days. We'd been there for a couple of months. And we woke up in the middle of the night because it sounded like somebody was just crashing into the apartment. And I must admit, I lay there and I thought, oh God, not this again, because I just thought it was sleep paralysis. And it was a person. The letting agent had given somebody the key to the apartment to go and have a look at it, not realizing he was still in it. So he got incredibly drunk and then just crashed in at 4 o'clock in the morning. So
that is scary.
Yeah, so that's me being all complacent, just thinking it was the normal, it was the head stuff, and it actually was a drunken guy staggering around the place.
What? Oh my! That's like an actual nightmare. Yeah, that reminds me of my own. Okay, so it's actually somebody in the comments right now. The Earth, listener to the show, she has her own podcast that interviews people who've had anomalous experiences.
Oh yeah.
Interviewed me about my hypnopompic hallucinations. And I have this family farm. My grandparents had it. They left it to my brother and I. That's why I have that opportunity. But the farmhouse is like a 19th century carriage barn, and it has not been renovated. Like, you know what I mean? So you're kind of like living in nature inside the house. And
yeah,
there are very big spiders in there, bat problems and stuff like that. So then it's like when I'm not there anymore, like my typically if I'm having a hypnopompic experience, it's like of a bat or a spider, and it's like
yeah,
waking up or a mouse like running across the bed or something, and it's like because they're commonplace objects or the creatures, I don't know sometimes fundamentally if they were real or not, and it
yeah,
wasn't until I was living with my wife and stuff when I would like wake up and like wake her up and try to get her to get out of the room because there's a bat flying around, and she would like literally tell me like there isn't one, and I'd see it like disappear
yeah,
instantaneously, and then I was like, oh, okay. But there's this mechanism that I never self-identified, but only through the conversation with the Earth there, Rachel. She was asking me questions, and I realized that like when the hallucination is actively occurring, there has never been a time when I wasn't certain in the moment that it was real. And I couldn't, even with my and I didn't experience this prior to this, but when my wife was like actively saying to me that's not there, I
yeah,
remember distinctly, it's like I couldn't accept until it disappeared that it wasn't real. And it made me
yeah.
wonder, like, is there a connection? Like, it made me empathize with people who have like kind of continuous experiences like this, because it's like I wouldn't have imagined that mechanism existing, and then after experiencing
Yeah.
it's like, wow, there might not be like a choice to separate these things.
Well, it
It
makes
isn't
you realize
concerning.
that sort of oral hallucinations, for example, are not as uncommon as you might imagine in a regular population. There's and people can hallucinate things. One of the things, I have lucid dreams, very much associated with sleep paralysis, and one of the things about lucid dreams is that you look around and a few times I've looked and I've thought, okay, I must see whether or not I'm kind of actually, whether or not this is all fuzzy. And whether or not it's actually rendering properly. And I look and everything is just total detail in a way that it isn't in my normal daytime perception. And the reason,
Okay.
and the reason for that, I think, is that because same for everybody. There's this sort of section right in the middle, and that's, you can see that highly in focus. You can see the colors properly, and then there's this stuff out here, and this is most alert to to movement. You can't perceive colors so well out there, and the reason for that is you don't need to be using your neural bandwidth on stuff on the periphery. All you need to be able to do is to figure out as quickly as possible if there's a tiger going to jump onto you. So when you have a hallucinatory experience, because your brain doesn't do the out of focus thing, it either produces something or it doesn't. I think you kind of you have a perfect rendition of it, because that is what your brain is thinking of. And when you are lucid dreaming, you can feel the gas tank draining. You know that you don't have enough kind of enough energy left to carry on with this fully saturated hallucination for very long. If you want to extend it, you can do something like you can usually do either a vestibular sort of stimulation or a touch stimulation. You can rub your hands together like that. That might give you a bit more. Or you can spin on the spot, and that might give you a bit more as well. But ask anybody who lucid dreams regularly, and that's what happens to them. They are aware that they are running out of neural bandwidth, because this, your brain is producing such a saturated perfect image. And I bet you that's what's happening with your spiders as well. It is, it's beautifully rendered. It's totally real until it disappears. I mean, I had dancing mice once.
That's not so
you go
bad.
to you go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, you're just sitting there sort of like this, and there's just loads of Disney dancing mice in front of you. And I mean, fortunately, I knew what it was. But if you speak to somebody, when somebody gets retinal damage, You quite often get this with somebody who's got diabetic retinopathy, or perhaps they've had a stroke and they've got bits of the visual field are missing. Your brain can't handle nothing for a while. It does eventually, you just get the black spot. But for a while, your brain goes, no, something's supposed to be in there. And you can get hallucinations. And they're not delusions. Delusions is when you think they're there. Hallucinations are when you know they aren't. And people get very alarmed by these. I mean, I spoke to one man who he was in tears. He thought he was going mad because this is such beautiful images, perfectly rendered in bits of his visual field, but it was just his brain just sticking something in there. And when that happens, after a couple of months, it tends to go. Your brain realizes, no, there isn't anything there actually.
Right. And so people like who have these kinds of experiences that you're describing are, at least from what I've seen, often put at the center of these communities, paranormal, supernatural, in very specific forms, especially I would argue occult and UFO. I'm not sure what others would apply, but there's this core element in the development of the original modern occult practices in the 19th century, where when I was looking into it, I was saying there's always like a central figure who believes or is saying that they are experiencing communicating with entities of some kind. And then that information transfers down into the population and it sort of builds up from there. With these specific experiences though, so you're kind of in a unique situation where you're having kind of these experiences in some ways that you can look at and say like, oh, back in the day, these would have potentially been significant or perceived as significant. And yet a lot of the people in the supernatural communities themselves are not experiencing these things directly, but are like listening to somebody who is experiencing them and interpreting them in a specific way. Have you, in your experience, come across like a method that best allows people who are sort of engaged with this kind of experience to think about it more broadly? Like in communicating your experiences, have you found a way to get people to consider that interpretive lens that you're describing more effectively?
I think it depends who you are in that organization. The psychologist William James defined what he called as a religious genius, and he felt that there were people who had who were themselves had potent religious experiences. He wasn't saying that those experiences were veridically real, but he was saying that they had them and that they were able to charismatically pass these on to other people. Now, of a lot of people who have these experiences, a great many of them won't be able to pass them on to anyone because they will be too caught up in their own experience to actually communicate. I'm thinking of people, for example, with temporal lobe epilepsy who can have incredibly strong religious hallucinations. If you are so tied up in your own experience, you're actually not particularly interested in passing a message on. But there are people who kind of manage to get between the two, and so he thought that there were these people who had the genius, they had the initial thing, and then there were a load of people afterwards who followed, who sort of formed the more corporate level of the religion, if you like. And sometimes a religion would survive the initial charismatic person, and sometimes it wouldn't. Most often it doesn't. You most often get a cult for the lifetime of the person who is able to start it, and then after that you kind of it just isn't organized enough. And I think you saw this with the Fox sisters, for example, in upstate New York in the 19th century. They actually admitted later that they faked a lot of the stuff that happened to them, that they started out doing it for attention. And they spent the early years of their lives touring around as psychics, as mediums, and helped to inadvertently start off a new religion, spiritualism. And by the time that they were admitting that they had made it up, or one of them specifically admitted that she made it up, and the other one was sitting in the audience kind of as a confirmer, if you like, it was too late. The momentum had already been carried away, and this wasn't so there were different kinds of psychologies and needs of individuals throughout that whole process. To begin with, there were some teenage girls who were not very educated, not very well traveled, and they wanted attention. And then after that, there were a couple of Quakers, Isaac and Amy Post, who were kind of intermediaries. They had clout in the community, but they believed what was happening with the girls. So they were out, in effect, lending their reputations to it and being promoters. And then after that, you had a community of people who bought into this religion, who bought into this religious movement. Initially, probably kind of, your sort of tent revival type people, and then later on, a bit more sober, a bit more sort of, middle class, front room kind of stuff. So you've got these different stages, and different people are signing on to the same story for different reasons. So really, it depends on, after that, whether or not your religion becomes corporate enough that you can produce a standardized product and keep it going.
Right. This is something that actually has deeply interested me the more I looked into the occult. And I've talked before several times on this show about how I historically have experimented with psychedelics like magic mushrooms, especially numerous occasions. I found them, it's like replicable experience as long as you're doing the dosage correctly. And then the psychedelic effects are, they produce a quantifiable experience in some ways that, as I said, is replicable. And that's, why there's so much research being done right now on potentially decriminalizing, regulating. When I'm looking into the occult and stuff, I'm seeing rituals being described, and then I'm seeing the subjective, qualitative experiences of people at the top levels of these rituals being described, and there's a very similar thing there. And then looking into UFO abduction reports and people talking about sort of like the altered reality and stuff that they sometimes experience in relation to these things, like there's something going on there underneath. Like there is this appeal of altered states fundamentally in some way to humans, it seems. When I'm looking at the occult stuff and I'm seeing that people are, engaging in pretty intense activities to trigger these things, and then there are people who are completely removed from that culture, like the continental philosopher Foucault, for example. He wrote about, in the 70s, he traveled to California, did LSD numerous times, and engaged in ritual BDSM practices that he then described as being the peak human experience. And it's the same exact language as these people in Aleister Crowley's What Golden Dawn are talking about in the late 1800s. Is there, within skeptic culture, when I've engaged with, often it's a little bit like, it's not as sort of bouncy and fun and as exciting as some aspects of the paranormal culture. Like these people are sort of like, getting into the sort of fun sides of things. And like, there are like get-togethers with skeptics and stuff. Is there a place for that sort of like more intense level of engagement with these things within the modern skeptic culture, in your view?
Oh, skeptics have access to mushrooms too.
Yeah, well, I'm evidence of that, I guess.
So I think it's I think it comes down to a lot of personality traits, and it's how you express your religiosity and how you express your skepticism. And just because you're a skeptic, it doesn't mean to say that you're not open to a numinous experience. There are, as you quite rightly point out, there are altered states. There are a range of ways to get to them, and you could deprive yourself of food for 3 days, being a monk in a cell, or you could do some shrooms. And we all have the same brains, so they're likely to be similar kinds of experiences. A lot of them are bad as well. I mean, people have to be careful, because you get stuck in dark places. You can get stuck in dark places with lucid dreaming if you kind of do the supercharged pharmaceutically enhanced versions. So Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the personality traits of the. There are a lot of people. I mean, people who go to church as well. They will swear that they believe in God, they believe in sort of Christ and all his angels and everything, but they've never had a personal experience. That they're as flat as a pancake from that point of view, and they have more in common personality wise, I guess, with a skeptic who doesn't know what anybody's going on about too. You know,
Interesting.
it's yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me. Like we did a Twitter space a while ago, and I wish Nick was here. He was looking forward to talking to you because he used to do the ghost hunting and stuff. So, but he talked about in the space we were going around talking about whether we've had access to these sort of altered states and stuff, and he was saying that he doesn't actually experience any kind of altered state even from music or anything. And you know, it's an interesting thing. Like there is a big variation there, and he
There
was
really is.
more open to sort of the paranormal stuff, but then he didn't have access to the numinous as you were describing. And then me, on the other hand, like kind of being like pure materialist all this time, and then I'm hitting hard, you know, psychedelics. You know, so there's a huge variation there.
Yeah, I think isn't that strange? Don't you find it strange when you meet someone? I've only met one person, but there are people who just kind of think that you're faking it with music. They're going, people don't really feel anything, do they? I mean, the rhythm's good when you're working out, but people don't feel anything with music. And you're going, my God, you know, that's such a thing to miss out on.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's like, oh darn, that you're not accessing something that I find quite central to my day-to-day existence. Well, you
Yeah.
know, it's like, what are you doing to get that? Well, never mind. So, like, let me see. Like, pivoting a tiny bit here, I was wondering about like werewolves,
Mm-hmm.
and so the whole thing growing up, the classic is, you know, the werewolf on like the English moor or something.
Yeah.
Is there a reason that that kind of thing manifests more frequently in the UK, like the idea of the transition into the wolf or whatever? Is it culturally dependent, or is it kind of random?
I would say that there is common in most cultures is the idea that we have an affinity with animals. So the idea that there could be a transition between an animal and a human. Our culture has a very strict cut-off point, you know, because we philosophize that, you know, we have language where we're more important, that kind of stuff. A lot of traditional cultures would, you know, take on totemic animals and things like that. So they would
Oh,
identify far more with animals than we would. There is a lot of European mythology to do with people taking on animals. I mean, there's a sort of the Norse hero Bodvar Bjarki. There's a story about how there was a big battle, and there was a great big bear came in and joined in the battle and started sort of slashing everybody. And Bodvar Bjarki's friend noticed that he wasn't at the battle, so he ran back to the tent where he was, and Bodvar Bjarki was there, sort of just meditating. And he was shaking him and said, "Oh, no, no, come on, you've got to fight, you've got to fight." And Bodvar Bjarki said, "Oh, well, you know, I won't be as useful now." And when they both went back together, the bear had disappeared. And the idea was that Bodvar Bjarki was projecting himself as the bear and was being more useful. So it's kind of like there's a metaphor for a warrior as a bear or a wolf. And you know, the idea that literally he would inhabit the body of a bear, but the sort of the idea that there was a transition, that a man would embody the qualities of a bear were not antithetical to them. So
right.
yeah, so
Okay. This.
that's really not uncommon. Where we're familiar with wolves, it tends to be from the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe. And I would say most of the werewolf cases that we know of come from France. And in this case, it was werewolfism was an outcropping of witchcraft. And it was relatively late Yeah, it was relatively late in the witch trials, and the idea was, I mean, there were theologians who spent time thinking about whether or not it was possible physically to actually turn into a wolf, but they thought it was more likely that there was an aerial effigy that enveloped your body that made it seem to you and made it seem to onlookers as though you were a wolf, but you weren't a wolf really. And so there are various classic werewolf cases where somebody was actually ended up where people were tried for being witches who had shapeshifted, but that's a very specific subset of witch trials. And
Okay.
it's kind of it's unfair to wolves as well, because I think, you know, that malignant werewolf was something that that we've got into modern fiction. You know, this sort of grandma or the wolf dressing up as grandmother with little Red Riding Hood, that kind of stuff. We think of, or we
Yeah.
thought of wolves as being antisocial, bloodthirsty, and they're really not. They're actually they're very cool animals, and I think that they really have suffered as a result of this werewolf mythology taking, you know, kind of taking hold over the last 500 years or so.
Right. Yeah, they all basically never attack humans. I think there's like one recorded case, and like typically it's either juveniles that have lost their parent and not been properly socialized, or like
Yeah,
an elderly one that's sick. So
yeah,
yeah, that makes total sense to me. I never put together the connection between, and I should have, I suppose, werewolves and like Norse, at least you know, variety, but paganism involving
yeah,
you know, bear zerkers, wolf zerkers. Like yeah, that, I mean, I
yeah,
was familiar with the ritual practices that are understood. They're trying to take on the spirits of the animals. It makes sense to me from a psychological perspective. If I was going into battle to kill people, it makes sense to want some dissociation from that and to like sort of create the idea that it's not you in a sense, it's an animal, and then you can sort of dissipate that responsibility after the monster leaves, right?
yeah.
It,
There's some. I think there's been some work done that shows that when warriors or when soldiers cover up their faces before going into battle, they're far more likely to mutilate or torture or kill. So it's sort of taking on a persona and trying to use the persona of something potent, a top level predator.
and that's a ritual function as well, I suppose.
Yeah,
That. Um, and that was making me think. I'm part Icelandic, mostly English, but I have an interest in the Icelandic sagas because of that.
yeah,
Like my grandma, mom, I always had the kitchen witch in the kitchen and stuff. There were little, you know, folklore things. So found that interesting. And in the Greenlander saga specifically, it's right in the transition around the year 1000 when they were Christianized, but they were
yeah.
retaining pagan traditions. And so when there was a famine, for example, there's an elaborate description of a ritual where they bring a seer to predict the end of the famine, and they have everybody sort of sit in a circle, and then they're singing the warden songs. They're calling on the, except for it's translated in modern as the weirding songs, and
All right, okay.
you're calling on your warden spirit, your guardian angel, your fairy godmother to come and assist you, to inform you, and things like that. And so at that time, there was like this interesting mixture of the old and the new, and they weren't seen as necessarily contradictory. But I was thinking about the language, how warden ended up ward, your ward spirit, you call on your wards, and then it sort of over time transformed into this word weird. And it's
Yeah.
like you know, it's something that is the other, negative. You shouldn't do the weird. It's like bringing negative attention to you. Could you talk just a tiny bit about how, like, why is this stuff a threat to the sort of hierarchical religious institution, order, at least in Europe at the time? You know, obviously stays on in other places, but they like essentially eliminated the ritual practice of religion. When I was
Yeah.
looking at the occult, it was all reconstructed because it had entirely been eliminated in Europe, down into the most remote, like Norwegian Valley. They got rid of it.
Yeah.
Fully. Could you just talk a little bit about what your perception of why that was seen as so threatening?
Well, because it's an alternative source of power. You know, if you
Mm,
claim to have the only valid power in the universe, the only valid supernatural power, and then someone comes along and has another one, then that's a direct challenge to you. And this is something that occurs with monotheism, because if you take an empire like the Roman Empire, for example, they had their their whole range of gods, and when they went somewhere new, if somebody had a god that was very similar, they would go, oh yeah, that's Zeus, isn't it? That's Greek. Yeah, that's Jupiter. They would co-identify them, so they were looking for similarities all the time. I'm trying to think of the local goddess in Bath in England. Perhaps it was Solace, but yeah. Anyway, they went there. They found at this cult practice there, and it was the center of a cult, and they said, oh yes, that's co-identified with Minerva. So the whole idea was to try and find points of similarity, and then when you do that, somebody doesn't have an external fulcrum of power by believing in another god. They also believed that sometimes they would go somewhere really local and they go, oh, this is a local god. Yeah, it's still valid, but this is a local god. But where you have monotheism, you are making a claim that you have the only legitimate source of supernatural power that is available, and the other ones therefore must either be invalid or evil. And in early Christianity, in early Western Christianity anyway, there was a document called the Canon Episcopi, which broadly kind of, I think the earliest copy we have is kind of 9th century or so, 9th, 10th century, but it encapsulated the church's idea up to that point, which was that if you have people who were going around, pretending to have magical powers, they were witches, then what they were doing was morally wrong, but and you could chuck them out of the community because you shouldn't really go around being a witch. But that the actual potency, the validity of what they actually did, it wasn't real, that it was all a mirage, that they didn't actually have any power. And so you could tell someone off for thinking the wrong things and for kind of thinking antisocial things, but you couldn't tell them off for substantive damage, because how could they do it if they had no power? And it was necessary for that to be kind of reversed in order for there to be heresy and witch trials. Witch trials legally started off with heresy trials, really. So at some point there had to be a turn where turnover where they're saying, yeah, there is real substantive damage being done in the world by this witch, by this, that means there has to be a potent force, and that means that potent force isn't God if it's doing bad things. So it was kind of, it was necessary for Christianity to change in the West for that to happen.
When it comes to like witch trials and stuff, I can't help but think, like, I read a lot of papers about the natural world and stuff, and this one, it's not especially relevant, but there is a huge issue with pine beetles in North America where they're just destroying all of the pine trees. And there's a thing in the culture of the beetle, if you want to call it that, where when the population gets large enough, there's constraint on resources and stuff, they sort of turn against themselves, and then there's a percentage of the population that leave the community, and that's part of why the spread is so vicious, is that there's this perpetual push out of the community. And it's obviously very basic physical in the sense of a beetle, because they have no thought processes, but I can't help but sort of see something similar occurring in human culture, except we have these layers of interpretation and meaning that we apply to it. With I mentioned the sagas of the Greenlanders. The last record we have from that colony before it collapsed was about the year 1400. A merchant ship arrived back with letters announcing a marriage on the Greenland, and then a witch trial, which was done on a man, actually, interestingly, who was accused of witchcraft and burned at the stake because he had enchanted the ship captain's wife into having an affair. And, so there's the colony we know was under significant pressure based on resources. It was getting colder and things like that. And then this person who was a lifeline to the community had, his partner ended up in an affair situation, and the community ended up burning this person. Like, would you be able to comment to what extent is like, do the witch trials go down when there's more sort of resources, food, stability, and they go up when there's more strife in general? Is that an accurate statement?
Well, the belief in witchcraft of antisocial people is fairly endemic throughout pre-modern societies. So I think it's weird people reinventing themselves as virtuous witches now, because it really was a label applied from outside before, and you wouldn't want to be accused of it. So but that is completely separate from there kind of being a witch frenzy and a lot of witch trials. And so that was the 16th and 17th centuries represent a different kind of thing, you know, this era. You were saying that it was a man who was a witch. Actually, there are places in Europe in general, it was generally thought, I think, is about something like 30-70% men to women. So women were in a majority being accused of witchcraft, but there were places where men were in a majority. Or around the edges, around the periphery, as you said, in Greenland, Russia, places like that, where you would get the Baltic states, where you would tend to get men accused of witchcraft more than you would women. And witch trials, so many reasons for the great witch hunts in Europe, and people argue over what the causes were. But certainly they occur during times of great strife. And they also tend to occur at places where there is a lack of really strong formal government. So people can, in an ad hoc fashion, find a scapegoat and do dreadful things within their own communities. For example, in England, there weren't that many witch trials. There weren't that many people killed for witchcraft. But the largest number happened, you know, the sort of most condensed lot happened during the English Civil War in the 17th century, with Matthew Hopkins and John Stern and those two. So, and that would be a perfect example of when the government just wasn't functioning like it should do. There weren't sort of magistrates and things working normally. So the fact that they were under stress, and if their government was a bit dodgy, and they were desperately looking for a scapegoat, and you know, killing a witch is a form of scapegoat ritual.
Right, of course. Now, that is pretty neat. And what you just said, it made me think about I mean, we won't go into it right now, but the UFO thing, the breakdown occurred during the Trump years there, when all these government agents started coming out, talking about it more and more. And I've talked with, people, co-hosts in here, and among other people in the community about this, how it like seemed almost like the Trump administration was like a foreign entity within the American government almost. And like, you know, how was that influencing their communication strategy about this subject? Now, a question that Leah proposed has to do with the breakdown of consensus reality in the modern day. And so, like, there's two sides to that, obviously, because like I would argue that historical loci of power presented a consensus reality that was largely inaccurate to what I would say is actual reality. It would sort of be like what is it? Zim, the historian, A History of the People, I believe is called, and the American. It's like the actual history of the oppressed people in the Americas. Like George Washington was the wealthiest landowner, became president. He also, on the weekends, engaged in acts of horrific genocide, enslavement, all this stuff. So when you have the central authority falling apart, it's intriguing to me that there's this sort of parallel in the UFO side. And like what's your view on?
It is kind of, and also it's interesting to work out the causal relationship with that as well, because you're thinking, well, is it because Donald Trump is a bit random that people are believing in UFOs, or is it because the world is a bit random that Donald Trump got elected and people believe in UFOs?
yes, okay, I get it.
It's kind of, you know, it's working out the causal relationships there. So I think Donald Trump is a symptom of something.
Yes. Yes, he certainly is. There's something problematic occurring in the heart
Yeah,
of America. And we all hope that America recovers. Well, not all, but largely, because it's going to be a
yeah,
real issue if there's a bigger problem. So I guess we'll aim to close out in about 9 minutes at the bottom of the hour. Unfortunately, I guess Leah got held up in her meeting, sadly. I know she was excited to be on here. Let me think. On a closing note, actually, okay, you are a prominent member of the mainstream skeptic community. I really deeply respect your opinion. So in this show, I have like my thing that I do, uapstudy.com, where I'm trying to, naturalize the UFO phenomenon to varying, degrees of success. I get some criticism from skeptics about my approach specifically. So I'd love to have this moment to have you sort of tell me if I just sound crazy, if it's not useful at all for me to present it from this lens. On my website, and I don't know whether to include it or not, there are, and this is what I'd like to hear your opinion on. Now, there's a huge issue with conspiracy theory in the UFO
yeah,
subject. There are also and I have no interest in conspiracy theories in general. There are documented, historical realities that we know of. For example, the United States had an elaborate listening system in the Pacific Ocean through the Cold War, where they knew the exact locations of the Russian nuclear fleet, and they kept that secret for several decades. They sent out, the CIA did a huge operation to recover a nuclear sub that had been lost by Russia. Russia didn't know where it was. The Americans knew exactly where it was through this listening technology. Nobody knew for decades. So there are very interesting, elaborate historical conspiracies. And so on the website, I include a section about like the documents that we have available from the government in relation to UFOs. Now, the most interesting one that I find is actually from the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense, released in 2000. It's a report prepared by Defense Intelligence Section 55, and The Guardian did a significant number of features on it. BBC News, Wired did elaborate features. We know the exact details of this. We know it was a real document. It was used to brief all senior leadership within the Ministry of Defense. All this stuff. So this report says that UFOs, it says, indisputably exist, have the features that are typically reported in the especially anomalous residual of difficult to explain cases. Lights of various colors, they accelerate instantaneously, come down, landed, all this stuff, orbit via airplanes and stuff like that. And they say that it's indisputable these objects exist. And then it says, we are almost certain that they are an unusual kind of expression of atmospheric electricity, a kind of ball lightning. And it says, like, we've briefed our leadership, we don't really want to talk about this publicly because we think that the Russians are ahead on this very particular kind of plasma physics, and we don't want to bring attention to that, yada, yada, yada. Is there, in your opinion, any value in me even including that on there? Or as a skeptic, do you find that that is distracting and sort of makes you think conspiracy theory?
No, I think you should include it because it exists. And also, you could start off your own conspiracy theory, which is that you are you are part of the whole thing.
Oh, I don't have to start that one. I've people have put a lizard head on me online. Like, I am in the conspiracy. Don't worry.
Because here you are trying to set yourself up as a source of knowledge, and yet you are suppressing some of the key knowledge. So yeah, I mean, if it's out there, you've got to include it. And also, as you quite rightly point out, just because some people believe in conspiracy theories, it doesn't mean that conspiracies don't happen. It's just that people who believe in conspiracy theories tend to have kind of specific traits. Like, for example, they believe in more than one. They're not particularly put off when some of them are mutually exclusive. They still believe in them fairly fervently. So I mean, I think you put all the information out there, and it just makes you look like you're being a bit more straight up. I mean, the thing that would really be awful is if you were selective with your information.
That's a hilarious point I didn't think about. Like, because if I take that off and then somebody pulls up the Wayback Machine and they're like, he's suppressing it, that would maybe be even worse.
like you said, just get your lizard head ready.
Yes, yes. Oh no, I love it. I love that stuff. It's funny. Actually, okay, let's see here. We got a little comment here. Why do so many male podcasters place the obligatory guitar in shot? That's a good question. The answer is I play guitar. I didn't put it on the wall, actually. My wife did, but
Okay.
I chose to podcast in front of it because you
Yeah,
know
well,
what? I guess I'm showing off that I can do music. I'll
that's
give you that.
true. And then in that case, why do so many female podcasters have the head of Pazuzu?
What is
In
that?
That's the that is the storm god Pazuzu, Babylonian storm god that was used as the devil himself in The Exorcist. Not the
Oh,
original. It's a copy, but
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. That's so cool. Okay, yeah. Yeah, you need a wall of things for people to point out
yeah.
and criticize a little bit. It makes it fun. Okay, well, it's been a lot of fun, Deborah. I really enjoyed this
It has. I've
conversation.
really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you ever so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And hopefully, maybe in a couple months, we could have you back and I can lock down my co-hosts because I know that they have a ton of different things that they could bring to the table. And
That would be fantastic. Yeah, thank you.
excellent. Is there anything that you're working on right now you want to draw people's attention to? I have your links in the show notes below to your website and Twitter.
Okay.
Is there anything else you'd like to plug right now?
Yeah, follow me on Twitter if you want to follow me most. That's what I'm on most of the time. And also, I don't know what reception is like internationally, but on BBC Sounds at the moment, Uncanny is the podcast that I'm most frequently on, where people have anomalous experiences, and we have there's a believer and a skeptic usually comment. So that's kind of what I'm doing at the moment. But if you want to know what I'm doing in general, then it's always on the website.
Excellent. All right. Well, I guess that'll wrap us up for this week, everybody. It's great to have got the show going, even though I was running it solo. This is actually the first show I've done entirely solo, and I screwed up the beginning, but I kept it going, I think, for the most part. And yeah, so anyway, yeah, thanks so much, Deborah. I'll close this off
Thank
now.
you.
Yeah, cheers.